Hi everyone, it's Brooke and I'm going to talk about my illness story. Um, this story is about mostly my dad's injury and my involvement in his treatment, care, and somewhat recovery. So last February, I was here in Shawnee and my dad was in Henderson, Nevada. And we got a call Wednesday night from my youngest brother, Reese. He's 16. And Reese said, Dad fell off of his bike. And I think at that time he knew that he had broken his clavicle or his collarbone, and they were at the ER when Reese called. And so my dad was out riding his bike with our dog, Zach, who's about 100 pounds. And Zach darted off in another direction in front of my dad's bike, and he just hit Zach really hard and flipped over the top of the bike and landed on his shoulder, I guess. And that broke it. So Reese took Dad to the ER that night, and that's when we found out about it. So the next day, so on this slide, there's a broken clavicle, and then there are some complications such as AFib and a pulmonary embolism, which I'll go into a little bit later. But those are all big topics of the illness story. So I talked to my dad on Thursday, the day after it happened, and he was just in a lot of pain and didn't sound that great on the phone. And it was just him and Reese at home because my mom was actually in Africa on a mission trip, and so she had no idea that this had happened and obviously was not there to help care for my dad and Reese. And so I think after talking to my dad, I was contemplating going out there and helping him because at this point on Thursday, we didn't know all the things that were involved in this injury, but it was a really good thing that I did end up flying out there on Friday. I drove down to Dallas Friday morning and flew out of Love Field, and my in-laws picked me up in Nevada Friday night, and I saw my dad, and it kind of was just a really busy weekend from then on. So let's see, he saw a specialist after the ER. The ER gave him meds that night, and he was, I guess, referred to a specialist. And so the specialist said, yeah, we need to do surgery to realign your bones. And before that could happen, though, he needed to get just like a checkup on his whole body. And so I think that happened Sunday night. And when he was at that checkup, they found that his heart had a irregular rhythm, which is called AFib for short. But because of that, it was too risky to do surgery, and they also found something in his lung. They weren't sure what it was, but there was a little something on a X-ray that made doctors a little hesitant about doing surgery. So I remember that night after he did his checkup, we drove to the ER right after that, and he went in. I think I went home to get some textbooks and went back, and he said that they needed to admit him because they weren't sure what was happening, and it was it could have been too risky for him to not be there. And so that was a really hard night for the both of us. He was in pain and tired and just didn't want to be at the hospital again. And I think it was the first time that I saw him cry like he did, and we were both kind of emotionally upset and worn out. But I'll definitely remember that evening that we realized that he couldn't have surgery and that he needed to just be in the hospital. So the next day I went back to the hospital, and let's see, they did like electrocardiograms and looked at his heart, and then they decided to do a cardioversion to see if they could get his heart back into regular rhythm. And so they did a treatment where they shocked his heart basically back into rhythm, and that worked for him. But then they still didn't want to do surgery because of the pulmonary embolism in his lung, and so they put him on blood thinner and just said, kind of, we'll monitor your heart and we'll monitor your lungs, and just keep coming back for checkups. And so that whole process lasted about a day and a half. I think we left the hospital. He checked in Sunday night, and was just, he couldn't get a room. There are too many people, so he was just on like a hospital bed in the middle of the ER. It was pretty unpleasant for everyone involved. And then Monday he got a bed, and we were able to check out Tuesday late afternoon. So it's not, I guess not a lot happened, but we felt like we were at the hospital for a really long time, just waiting for all those procedures and the doctors to talk to us, and all the things involved in that sort of thing. So his clavicle bone did kind of fuse back together, but it was not great, and he was still experiencing some lack of mobility, and so he actually had surgery in December to realign the bone, and they put some plates in, and so now his shoulder is essentially back to normal, and his recovery from that surgery is over, and so this whole incident is behind him, but it's definitely something that our family remembers and that we talk about. So a strength during this whole time that I have realized is that I got to see a different perspective of my dad, and he seemed a little more, I guess, human to me. He showed his emotions more than I had seen him do that, and his feelings of just frustration and impatience were visible. And so I appreciated that he was able. He probably didn't want to do that, but he wasn't trying to cover up anything on my behalf. And because it was basically just my dad and I experiencing all this together, Reese was working and at school, and he couldn't really be at the hospital with us. I feel like my dad and I got really close, and so I treasure that good thing that came out of this whole experience. I was able to see a lot of our church family support us. They would call me, ask me how we were doing. They prepared food for us. We had a lot of food. Some of my dad's friends came and visited us. They sat with me during the cardioversion, and it was just really good to have that support around us during that time. I know my dad missed exercising and his hobbies because of this arm injury, and he had to go to a few trips later on in the year, and so he his arm was in a sling for a long time, and I know that posed a challenge for him. And even after he didn't have to wear a sling, the arm wasn't fully, or his shoulder wasn't fully back to normal, and so that was still something that he had to work through until he had the surgery, and then he had to still recover from that. So it was like a year later that he finally was back to normal. So I guess, like I said, this experience brought unity between my dad and I, and between our family, and it's kind of one of those memories that we now have that unites us. And even though my mom wasn't there, she was a part of it in some way. We finally told her before she came back, and so had a long conversation with her in the hospital about what had happened. And I guess it's just one of the points in our family's history that we look back and talk about, and mostly with positive things to say. And so at the time, it was a struggle that we have overcome together, and that's, I guess, the role that it's played in our family dynamics. And I know my younger brother had to step up and help care for my dad and provide dinner, maybe like the first 1 or 2 nights. And then he was kind of just independent the rest of the time, because we were doing all the medical stuff, and he still had to take care of his responsibilities. So our dynamics did kind of shift, especially since my mom wasn't there. I guess I filled her role as best as I could as a support and strength for my dad. So this was my first, I guess, real perspective of being in the medical field or in the hospital. I spent a lot of the time in the ER with my dad, and it is so busy, and there are people everywhere, and it just seems like there are not enough nurses and doctors for all the people. And so when I was thinking about needing the quality of patience, it sounds just like the word patient, and I thought that was an interesting correlation, I guess, that it seems like patients will need to have a lot of patience within the medical field, because there's just a lot happening, and it's hard to not be, I guess, the center of attention, especially when you just don't feel good and something's in pain. You want to get it fixed right away, but often that can't be the case, because there's just so many other people and so many other responsibilities that practitioners and nurses have to deal with, and that can be really frustrating. And I know that my dad often got frustrated with just having to wait around, because he knew that nothing could be done, and he just was going to go home anyways, and so he was ready to do that before the time really allowed him to do that. And so with that experience, it helps me think about how an MFT could have helped us out a little bit. I think it would have been great for us to have someone just check in with us that wasn't doing routine tests and shots and stuff like that, but somebody that could be an empathetic listener and just get a different, our side of the story, without having to apply like medical language to it. I think that my dad would have appreciated that other like third person involvement. And I think in MedFT would be, they would be able to talk about the doctor's perspective and talk about my dad's perspective. And my dad really wanted to leave, and I think the doctors were encouraging him not to, but having that a MedFT kind of bridge that gap would have been helpful. And I think a MedFT would be able to normalize feelings of frustration and impatience that we were both feeling towards the end of Tuesday. And I think my dad, looking back, was kind of ashamed, or he just didn't like the way that he had behaved. And not that he was mean or anything, but just those feelings were kind of getting the best of him, and he was definitely expressing them. And which is normal, I think. Lots of people feel that way, and so having someone just tell him that it's okay to feel that way, I think would have helped him be okay with those feelings. And we did have a really great support system, and a MedFT asking about that would have been good for us to be able to pinpoint who was kind of on our team helping us out, and that could have been relayed to the doctors that we have people that are on our side, and my dad's not just going home alone to care for himself, but that he has family and people who will help him out on this recovery journey. So, like I said, it's enlightening to think about this situation, having MedFT information and kind of applying it. I know that I was able to play a integral role in helping my dad, and what I learned about myself, that even that was kind of an emotionally challenging time, and I felt like I needed to be strong and uplifting and positive. Even though I didn't necessarily feel like that inside, I was able to just kind of push through and play that role. And I guess I hadn't really been put in a position where I needed to do that before. And now I have a better understanding of hospital patients' experiences, feelings, the emotions that they go through. Because not that I necessarily experienced it firsthand, but secondhand, and I know how it feels to just be in the hospital, kind of by yourself. And I've learned that patients and families may feel like they're just lost in a sea of people, nurses and doctors. I've kind of talked about that before, that there's just so much happening that they can feel kind of alone in that process. But a MedFT would be a great person to find them and come alongside them and be an encouragement, and offer the hope and positivity that is often lacking in situations like that. And not that doctors don't feel that way, and our doctors were very friendly, but they were just, that wasn't their role that they were playing, and so they were just telling my dad what he needed to do and what the next steps were, and the things that they needed to do. But a MedFT would offer a different element of support and encouragement. And then again, as a MedFT, I would love to know the support system that patients have, and if it is a great support system like we had, I would want to encourage that and highlight that aspect of their treatment and use that as a positive factor for them. And that is it about my illness story. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, I guess you can write about it in the discussion.